Let's take a look at the Tang and Sung dynasties of China as part of our exploration of golden ages. In this case, we're going to be looking at both dynasties and trying to get a good idea about why both dynasties were significant as one single golden age. Okay, again, two great dynasties in China. During the Tang, from 618 to 907, and the Sung, 960 to 1279, with both these dynasties, China became the richest, powerful, and most advanced country in the world. Again, so it's during the time period of both of these dynasties, essentially from 618 to 1279, that China really becomes a powerful place. Now, the main idea that I want you to get out of this exploration of these two dynasties. First of all, Tang and Sung China experienced an era of prosperity and technological innovation. So that's the key that you need to understand for the main idea. Why it matters now? Because Chinese inventions from this period, such as painting, gunpowder, and the compass, changed history. These would all be technologies that would later go on to influence places like Europe and change history forever. Okay, so understanding these two time periods in China is really important for us to be able to get a grasp about the importance of China in terms of its impact on the global world in which we live. All right, so let's take a quick look at this map. This says China in Sui and Tang dynasties, 589 to 907. Now the Sui dynasty is a smaller dynasty that came before the Tang dynasty. And we're not going to actually study much of this in class, but you should have an understanding that the changes that took place in the Tang dynasty really had many of their beginnings in the Sui dynasty. And what I can see here on this map are two different things. I can see that the brown areas represent the Tang dynasty from 618 to 907, and that yellow area out to the western part is lands that were under the influence of China, but China did not directly control it. You should make note, if you're looking, you can see this red line here. That, of course, is the Silk Road, and it's splitting on what they're calling the Tarim Basin, or what we know as the Taklamakan Desert. And again, they would have had influence over this region, but not direct control. So their direct control only extended to this furthest part of what we today call Donghuang, the city of Donghuang. Now here is the Sung dynasty. And you can see something's different. Remember, the Sung dynasty is later, it comes after the Tang dynasty. And what I can see is that previous yellow area that had been under the influence of the Tang is now no longer under the influence of the Sung. So the Sung dynasty is actually a smaller dynasty. And you should also notice too that the capitals have changed. The capital in this case is Kaifeng, and later on it will become Hangzhou. The Sung dynasty will actually be split into a northern Sung and a southern Sung dynasty. So it will be somewhat unstable at different points. But nevertheless, it's during this time period that many great innovations will come out of China. Now what I want you to do is look at both maps together. And in fact, in your journal, these maps are blank. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to color these sections in. So make sure you color in the section of both the green Sung dynasty, the brown Tang dynasty, and that yellow area that is influenced by the Tang dynasty. So make sure you can complete your maps inside your journal. Now, if you take a look at the two maps, you can see the Sung dynasty is clearly smaller than the Tang dynasty. And why that's important is because of the historical changes that were taking place. But also, the worldviews that both dynasties had was somewhat different. So the Tang dynasty worldview was essentially west along the Silk Road. So people in the Tang dynasty looked towards the west. They encouraged trade. They encouraged the migration of people from other places that come along the Silk Road. This is a time period where Buddhism will come to China, Islam will eventually come to China. Many merchants and traders will actually travel the full distance of the road and go to Xi'an, at that time the capital, and they will actually live there. Actually, it was known in that time period not as Xi'an, but Chang'an. So they will come to Chang'an, they will live there, they will trade there, they'll do business there, and it will be a fairly open society, at least through the height of the Tang dynasty. Now, as the Sung dynasty, on the other hand, is a very different worldview. It looks east towards the sea. So no longer is the Silk Road opened. It's not as free to pass it. They don't control it. There could have been nomads from the north who were interrupting the trade and the flow of people and ideas from the Western world to China at this point. But what was important to the Sung dynasty was having access to the sea. So they're looking more towards the east. They're maybe looking towards trade along the sea, along the coastal parts of China, whereas the Tang dynasty was looking towards the west and trade along the Silk Road. So these are two very different worldviews for these two different dynasties. Let's look then at trade and foreign contacts. Again, Silk Road makes the Tang Dynasty look towards the west, and ocean ships basically allows the east, or the Sung Dynasty, to look east for places like Korea, Japan, India, the Persian Gulf, and even East Africa. And in fact, during this time period, some fairly significant shipbound journeys will take place. Not as big as some of the ones that will take place during the Ming Dynasty, which comes later, but enough to get China started looking in a different direction than just the Silk Road. Now, we also have the issue of agriculture during this time period. What we know is that during the Song Dynasty, the Chinese began to import fast ripening rice from Vietnam. So this rice that they were bringing from Vietnam could actually grow more rice in a single season than the traditional types of rice that might have been grown in southern China at the time. So importing this fast ripening rice from Vietnam made it possible for them to increase food production. And again, it allows 2 crops for each season instead of 1. And this map on the right can show you the traditional rice-producing areas of China even today. It tends to be in the southern part of China, very different than what people eat in the north, which is mostly wheat and bread and noodles. In the south, you got a lot more rice and vegetables. Now, what was the impact of this agricultural change? Essentially, a feudal population increase. If I look, and I can see the growth in population is fairly dramatic. So if you look here, you can see that through the Han Dynasty, Sui, Tang, and into the early Song, population growth was fairly stable. And then near the height of the Song, they introduced this new rice from Vietnam, and you can see that the population began to increase. Now that increase was put on hold when the Yuan Dynasty showed up. There was a lot of warfare. The Yuan Dynasty, in fact, were the Mongols. So this was a period where the Mongols had taken control of China. And so that could account for why there was a population decrease. But eventually the Mongols would lose. They would be displaced from China and replaced by the Ming Dynasty, which was another Chinese dynasty. And then shortly after that, you can see because of the introduction of that rice and because of other social situations, the population began to take off through the Qing Dynasty, which grew very, very quickly. And you can see too, this is the last Chinese dynasty, all the way up to the modern era. And this chart only brings us to about 1990. And so we can see that China's population growth skyrocketed. And today, China is trying to get control of their population. They've tried to institute a one-child policy back in the 1980s, and they're trying to regulate the amount of children people can have because there's just not enough food to feed everybody with a population today of about 1.3 billion people. What's interesting about this chart, though, is if you want to understand the population problems of China in the more contemporary world, in our modern society, you really have to go all the way back to this introduction of fast-growing rice back in the Song Dynasty. This is definitely a factor that may have contributed to the rising population of China across history. Okay, let's take a look at science and technology. First of all, mathematics flourished in China. They were quite adept at using mathematics. This is an abacus on the right here. It's basically a calculator. These are not too difficult to use for basic math, but they get more complicated as you go along. I've had the opportunity to see people use these, and I've seen people use these almost as quickly as somebody can use a sort of electronic calculator that we might use in the United States. They also adopted the use of algebra and the concept of zero. Remember, the concept of zero actually comes from India, and algebra, of course, is an Islamic term. And so these would have been things or ideas that would have come along the Silk Road and would have influenced China. They also invented movable type. Now, movable type made it more efficient for being able to print documents. Keep in mind, China also invented paper. So in order to keep really accurate records and be able to keep those records on paper and to print multiple copies of them was something the Chinese were able to do quite early on with movable type. In fact, movable type is usually associated with the Koreans as being the inventors of movable type. In fact, China sort of displaced movable type in favor of traditional calligraphy, primarily because of tradition, but also because the movable type wasn't as functional, as useful as it might be with a language based on an alphabet, which we'll see later on in Europe, when Europeans will also begin to use movable type to print books. Now, they also developed gunpowder. Initially, it was not developed as a weapon. In most cases, it would be used to scare away evil spirits, perhaps, at weddings or funerals or at certain holidays. But of course, it could be used very easily for weapons later on. So here's a chart. This chart is actually in your packet, and I want to make sure that you complete the one that's in your packet. There may be the categories that are missing over here on the left-hand side. So we've got porcelain in the late 700s. We've got the mechanical clock in the 700s. We've got printing or block printing or movable type, both in the 700s and 1040. We've got explosive powder in the 800s, paper money in 1020s, and then the magnetic compass, which would be used for navigation in the 1100s. So this chart is in your journal, and I just want to make sure that you record all that information properly and that you know the significance of both the description and the impact of each of these things and how they not only influence China, but would later on go on to influence the world. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We're just going to take a little twist on other aspects of their innovations and their technological advancements. And one thing to consider is this golden age of art. So for instance, wealth, education, and urban culture often equaled artistic achievement. So when we look at the Tang Dynasty in particular, we'll see that these things are clearly associated with people living in the Tang. They were wealthy, they were well educated, and they lived in the capital city of Chang'an, and it reflected urban culture. So you can see that in this case, these are some tomb paintings that reflect everything from the style of dress that women would wear, the hairstyles that women would wear, and all of these things represented sort of urban elite culture. We also know that this is a period of great poetry, and the most famous are Li Bo, or usually known as Li Bai, and Du Fu. These are the two great poets of ancient China. And oftentimes Li Bai in particular would spend a lot of his time dedicated to writing about Chang'an and life in Chang'an. And Du Fu, of course, was Li Bai's best friend and often would write poetry about Li Bai as well. In fact, when Li Bai died, Du Fu was sort of shattered by the loss of his great friend. We also have this. This is what we call three-color ware. It was one of the greatest contributions to the Tang Dynasty. And it was a very unique pottery style. Again, it looks like it's a tri-colored horse in this case, and this would have been very typical of Tang Dynasty pottery. And so an art historian looking at this would instantly recognize this as a Tang piece. These would often be found in tombs. It also represented that people liked horses, and the horse was a common element used in artistic creation at that time period, whether it be writing a poem, painting a painting, or in this case, making pottery. Okay, again, many of these figurines were predominantly horses and camels, and so they produced a great number of these. In this case here, the camel is quite interesting because it also is considered a piece of tri-colored pottery, but again, it may reflect the significance of the Silk Road as a major trading route. If a wealthy merchant could afford to have pottery created, he most likely would have something create that reflect his wealth and his status in society. And since as a trader and a merchant who probably made his money off the Silk Road, he would have in this case had a camel made because that would have been the primary means by which goods were brought back and forth between the West and China. Here's some more examples of tricolored pottery. These are really quite exquisite pieces that would have been found in tombs. Again, reflecting the status and wealth of the people who would have been buried in those tombs. But they're great pieces of artwork as well as reflections of people's wealth and status. And again, it says at the top here, most of these pieces have been found in more affluent tombs of the Tang period. So this is a collection of tricolored pottery. And what I notice is over here on the left are horses, which suggests that these people were of nobility. Over here, there are camels, which suggests they may have had something to do with the Silk Road trading and may have made their wealth from that venture. And I can also see here is a servant, perhaps somebody who watches their camels or maintains their caravan. And what's interesting is I notice that he's bearded. Perhaps he's Chinese, but perhaps he's not. Maybe he's somebody from Central Asia who's employed by these people. Again, here is perhaps the husband and the wife. They're quite tall in this case, which means they're people of status. And these other figurines are reflections of Buddhist symbology. These are Buddhist guardian gods. So this also tells me that these people would have been practicing Buddhism, which at that time was a foreign religion that would have come to China via the Silk Road. Okay, so just by looking at this collection of pottery, I can understand the economic well-being of these people. I can understand their religious practices, their social status, and perhaps their like for horses and their economic background and connection with foreign trade as well. Okay, so sometimes the pottery and tombs tells us a lot more than just that they had good pottery. All right, so let's do a quick summary here. If we're going to compare the Tang and Song dynasties, let's take a look at the Tang. In this case, they expanded the empire. They actually had a female ruler. This would be the Empress Wu, who we'll take a look at in a few minutes. And also, they adopted Buddhism. And for the Song, they ruled a smaller empire, developed into a great sea power, and created paper money and movable type. So what did they both then have in common? They prospered through trade, improved agriculture, and created great art and literature. Okay, so there are some aspects which are Tang, some are Song. Together, they make the Tang and Song dynasties a single golden age. That's why we try to study both dynasties together as one single period. Because even though politically the Tang and Song dynasties changed, the prosperity continued, and Chinese culture was not disrupted from the change between Tang and Song like it may have been in earlier dynasties.